Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Ron Williamson, who, along with Robert Von Bitter, co-edited the book The History and Archaeology of the Iroquois du Nord. The title is part of the University of Ottawa Press Mercury series, which is published in partnership with the Canadian Museum of History. The title offers a close examination of several village sites around the north shore of Lake Ontario established in the mid to late 17th century by the Haudenosaunee or Five Nations Iroquois. The title's contributors bring together Indigenous knowledge and recent archaeological findings that greatly advance the historical context of these sites, which, until now, have had very little written about them. This four-part series of The Authority File is brought to you by Ottawa University Press. In this first episode, Ron talks about his research background, how the book came together, and what the Mercury series is all about. Okay, Ron, welcome to the program.
Well, it's good to be here.
Excellent. So let's start with a little bit about you. Can you tell us where you're teaching and what you're currently researching?
Sure. For most of my career, I was the managing partner of a firm, a consulting firm called Archaeological Services, Inc., which provided above ground and below ground heritage identification and mitigation services for any land development in Ontario and surrounding territory. Ontario has some of the strongest legislation out there around identifying heritage resources in advance of land development that might eliminate those resources. So I, very early in my graduate career, founded Archaeological Services, Inc. And at the same time, however, once I had completed my graduate work, I also had one foot in the academic world with graduate faculty appointments at both the University of Toronto and Western University with adjunct status, which allowed me to kind of stay in touch with recent and current trends in both the literature, the academic literature, and also teaching. So I'm still at ASI, although I'm retired from the managing partner. I'm still there as a senior associate. I provide advice most of the time on large Huron-Wendat, who are Iroquois, farming villages from the period between, let's say, 700 and 400 years ago. I'm still active as an adjunct professor at Western University, where I sit on graduate committees, usually for examinations, and a few other universities that ask me to do that. I currently work with the Huron-Wendat Nation on a number of projects as well.
Excellent. So I'm just curious with the ASI. I mean, and in Ontario policies, do developers before they build or begin to build in a location, is there a step where they're required to check on potential archaeological importance, or is that something that happens if they happen to find something when they've already broken ground?
You know what happens in advance? So it's
Yeah.
part of the planning process, the land use planning process. And it occurs for both private and public sector land. So it's not
Hmm.
just major transportation routes or gas lines like it is in many places in the United States, but in Canada and especially in Ontario, it's also for private land. So if a developer buys 100 acres and is going to create a housing subdivision, one of the planning requirements will be that we do an archaeological and above ground heritage check and then
Hmm.
mitigate any impacts to those resources.
Right. Okay. Cool. So there was a bit of a mystery around the Indigenous settlements on the North Shore of Lake Ontario that launched a symposium and ultimately your book. Can you tell us how that all came together?
Sure. Um, Despite the book, there's still a lot of mystery.
Yeah.
The book has addressed some questions and really was written to focus future research efforts. The IDN, or the Iroquois du Nord, are in fact a series of Haudenosaunee settlements. Haudenosaunee used to be known widely as the Iroquois, but now they prefer the term Haudenosaunee because Iroquois is a European term that was applied. So the
Hmm.
IDN, or the Iroquois du Nord, established a series of satellite settlements along the north shore of Lake Ontario, and they were not in their homeland, original homeland, which was in central New York State. So we in Ontario also have things called archaeological management plans. And we began the process of carrying one of those out for Toronto. And this was back in the early to mid 2000s. And I became aware of two sites that were IDN settlements that were within the boundaries of the city of Toronto. One was called Tieagon, and one was called Ganatsawayagon. And these two settlements are villages that the Seneca established on the North Shore near the mouths of major streams or major rivers that drain into Lake Ontario from the moraine above Toronto. And this led to policies about monitoring construction and impacts to those sites. And in the case of Tieagon, we made a series of discoveries of burials of Seneca women from the 1670s that gas lines were actually impacting. We
Wow.
were there in the cases of the two most recent ones. Burials had been discovered in the late 19th century and early 20th century as property was first built upon. But knowing that it was there through the archival record was how we were able to be present and monitor the discovery of these burials and find them. At the same time, my co-editor Robert Von Bitter was working with a team on investigating the location of similar sites or the other eastern IDN settlements in eastern Ontario, and specifically in the area of Prince Edward County, which is just west of Kingston, Ontario. Listeners may know that place. So the team included Chris Menery, who was using LIDAR imagery. LIDAR is using, it's a method really for determining ranges by targeting a surface with a laser and then measuring the time for the light to return back to the receiver. And this gives you an image of what is on the ground. And sometimes it's far better than even aerial photography. This identified some targets for some of the other eastern sites. Um, there was also a program that Von Bitter and his colleagues started to look at an archaeological site called Kente, where there was a Sulpician mission, but also a Cayuga village. Cayuga and Seneca are other Haudenosaunee nations. And he had doubts that the place that somebody in the 1950s, an avocational archaeologist, had thought they had identified Lake Consacon, or had identified Kente on Lake Consacon, a small lake in Prince Edward County. He had doubts about that, and based on very careful review of the archives of another avocational archaeologist who worked in the 20th century, and those archives are held at the Royal Ontario Museum, when looking at that archive and also the collection of assemblages that this guy recovered, he felt that he had a better candidate for the site of Kente. So this all led to the various participants in the book, most of whom participated in that conference at the Ontario Archaeological Society held in Toronto in 2019. And at the
Mhm.
conclusion of that, the editor of the series that the book is published in came up and asked if we would consider this series, to publish our results. So that was very fortuitous that Pierre de Rosier was in the audience at that time.
Excellent. And that series you mentioned is the Mercury series, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and its partnership with the University of Ottawa Press and the Canadian Museum of History.
Sure. Um, I think it was last year was the 50th anniversary of the Mercury series.
Hmm.
It's published by the Canadian Museum of History now in association with the University of Ottawa Press. It didn't used to be.
Okay.
But the series features, let's call it pioneering research in Canadian history, archaeology, culture, and ethnology. Uh, so when I was a student of archaeology, we all knew the series to be a kind of an exciting collection of very current research with many kind of leading authors, leading archaeologists and scholars, and considered them essential works. In 1972, Jim Pendergast, who was a retired lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces, he was a very renowned and prolific avocational archaeologist. He was hired as an assistant director at the Canadian Museum of History, and as soon as he started, he was told by the director, William Taylor, that his first priority was publications, and he wanted them quickly. So while there had been serial publications at the museum prior to that, they were known as bulletins, research bulletins. Um, they were only a few volumes a year, and what happened is Pendergast decided to put out very speedy publications, and in fact, his wife decided that the best name for them would be Mercury, kind of to note a figure from Roman mythology known for his ability to deliver messages at a lightning speed.
Right.
So the series has more than about 100 books to its name, and it currently publishes about 10 volumes a year. The partnership with University of Ottawa makes, and it's now a fully peer-reviewed series. It makes it just a beautiful. They make beautiful volumes with full color, high resolution images, both for maps and plates. And so we jumped at the opportunity to do our publication in that series.
You just heard from Ron Williamson. Ron is founder and senior associate of Archaeological Services, Inc., a private archaeological and cultural heritage consulting firm based in Ontario. He has also published extensively on Indigenous and early colonial Great Lakes history. This episode is brought to you with support from Ottawa University Press. Join us next week when we take a deeper dive into the book, learn more about one of the more mysterious sites, and why there's been a lack of published material on the archaeology of these sites. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.